No good deed goes unpunished. That's what they tell you when you live on the wrong side of the Brooklyn Bridge, where survival is the only currency that matters. When Blake Hastings, a maid's daughter drowning in medical debt, bought a hot meal for a shivering, confused old man on the street, she didn't expect a reward. She didn't expect that the frail man in the tattered coat was Vincenzo Romano, the elusive patriarch of the Eastern Seaboard's most ruthless crime syndicate. And she definitely never imagined that her single act of kindness would plunge her directly into the terrifying, intoxicating world of his son, Gabriel, a mafia boss who destroys absolutely everything he cannot control. The rain in New York didn't wash the streets clean. It just made the grime slicker. Blake Hastings pulled the collar of her worn trench coat tighter around her neck, her boots splashing through oily puddles on her way to her second job. At 22, Blake's life was a meticulously scheduled spreadsheet of exhaustion. By day, she attended community college, fighting tooth and nail for a nursing degree. By night, she waited tables at a diner in Bay Ridge. And in the hours between, she worried about her mother, Martha. Martha Hastings had spent the last 15 years scrubbing the marble floors and polishing the silver of New York's ultra-wealthy. It was back-breaking work that had left her with severe arthritis and a persistent, rattling cough that kept Blake awake at night, staring at the ceiling and calculating the cost of doctors' visits they couldn't afford. It was a Tuesday evening, the kind of cold that bites right through to the bone. Blake had just stepped off the bus, her fingers numb, when she heard the shouting. "Get out of here. I told you. I ain't running a charity. You're scaring the paying customers." The voice belonged to Sal, the owner of a corner bodega notorious for selling expired milk and stale bread. Blake stopped. Huddled against the brick wall beneath the bodega's blinking neon sign was an old man. He looked to be in his late 70s, wearing a tweed coat that might have been expensive a decade ago but was now stained and smelling faintly of damp earth and old cigars. He had no umbrella. The rain was matting his silver hair to his forehead, and his hands, shaking violently, were clutching a crumpled, empty paper cup. I just need to use the telephone," the old man mumbled, his voice carrying a thick, gravelly Italian accent. His eyes, a startlingly piercing shade of pale blue, were clouded with confusion. "My boy is coming," he said. "Wait by the fountain." "Where is the fountain?" "There ain't no fountain in Brooklyn, crazy old man. Now scram before I call the cops." Sal raised a broom, taking a threatening step forward. "Hey!" Blake yelled, the word tearing from her throat before she could stop it. She stepped between Sal and the old man, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Leave him alone, Sal. He's not doing anything to you." Sal scowled, lowering the broom an inch. "Blake, you know this bum? He's not a bum. He's just lost." Blake turned her back on the bodega owner and knelt beside the old man. Up close, he looked incredibly frail, but there was a strange dignity in his posture. He wasn't slouching. He was sitting perfectly straight against the grimy brick. "Sir?" Blake asked softly, keeping her voice low and steady. "Are you okay? Do you know where you live?" The old man blinked, looking at her as if she had just descended from the clouds. "The fountain," he repeated, though his voice wavered. "Gabriel told me to wait. He gets so angry when I wander. He worries, you see. He carries too much weight on his shoulders." Blake's heart ached. Dementia. She had seen it enough times in her clinical rotations. The disorientation, the fixation on a specific, non-existent detail. She looked at his freezing hands. "Okay, well, Gabriel isn't here right now, but you can't stay out in the rain. You're going to catch pneumonia." Blake dug into her canvas tote bag. She bypassed her textbooks and pulled out a worn leather wallet. Inside was a single, crumpled $10 bill. It was her dinner money for the next 2 days. She looked at the old man, then at the $10 bill. She sighed, her breath pluming in the cold air. "Come on," Blake said, gently taking the old man by the elbow and helping him to his feet. He was surprisingly heavy, his bones dense. "There's a diner 2 blocks from here. I'm going to get you a bowl of minestrone soup and a black coffee. You like minestrone?" The old man's face broke into a fragile smile. "My late wife, Rosa, made the best minestrone. She put pancetta in it. Do they put pancetta in it? I don't know, but we'll ask. Blake lied smoothly, guiding him away from the bodega. They walked slowly, Blake holding her cheap umbrella over him, letting the rain soak her own shoulders. When they reached the diner, she sat him in a booth near the heater. She ordered the soup, the coffee, and paid up front, leaving the waitress her $10. I have to go to work now, Blake said, standing by the booth. You stay here. Eat the soup. The manager here is nice. I told him to let you sit until you warm up. Do you have a phone number? Someone I can call? The old man looked up from the steaming bowl. His pale blue eyes suddenly sharpened, a fleeting moment of terrifying lucidity cutting through the fog of his confusion. It was like looking down the barrel of a gun. You are a kind girl, he said, his voice losing its tremor, dropping an octave into a smooth, commanding baritone. What is your name? Blake. Blake Hastings. Blake Hastings, he repeated, testing the syllables on his tongue. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a heavy, intricately engraved silver lighter. He pushed it across the table. Keep this. For the soup. I can't take that, Blake protested, stepping back. Just stay warm, sir. Gabriel will find you. As Blake rushed out into the rain, already late for her shift, she didn't look back. If she had, she would have seen 3 massive, heavily tinted black SUVs screech to a halt outside the diner, and men in tailored suits pouring out, frantically rushing through the diner doors. She had just bought soup for Vincenzo Romano. The phone rang at 4:30 a.m., a shrill sound that sliced through the darkness of their cramped, one-bedroom apartment. Blake jolted awake, her hand slapping the receiver to her ear before it could wake her mother in the next room. Hello, she whispered, her voice raspy. Blake, it's Martha. Her mother's voice was strained, breathless with pain. I'm sorry, baby. I fell. My back gave out on the way to the bathroom. Blake threw off the covers, her bare feet hitting the cold linoleum. She rushed into the living room where her mother slept on the pull-out couch. Martha was pale, gripping the edge of the mattress, unable to sit up. Mom, I'm calling an ambulance, Blake said, grabbing her phone. No ambulances. We can't afford it, Martha gasped, grabbing Blake's wrist with surprising strength. Listen to me. Today is Friday. The Romanos are hosting a dinner tonight. If I don't show up for the morning prep, Mr. Silas, the estate manager, will fire me. He's been looking for an excuse. Mom, you literally cannot walk, which is why you have to go, Martha said, her eyes pleading. You know the routine. You helped me during the holidays last year. Just do the dusting in the East Wing. Help the kitchen staff with the crystal. Keep your head down, Blake. Do not speak unless spoken to. And whatever you do, stay out of the boss's way. Blake hated it. She hated the sprawling, ostentatious mansions of Long Island. She hated the way the wealthy looked right through her mother as if she were a piece of furniture. But she knew the math. Without Martha's paycheck, they would be evicted by the end of the month. Okay, Blake breathed out. I'll go. I'll take your uniform. Just rest. I'll call Mrs. Higgins from downstairs to check on you. By 7 a.m., Blake was standing before the wrought iron gates of the Romano estate. It wasn't just a house, it was a fortress. High stone walls, security cameras tracking her every move, and men in dark suits standing by the gatehouse with bulges under their jackets that Blake knew weren't radios. The estate manager, a severe man named Silas, eyed Blake with deep distaste. Martha sent her daughter, Silas sneered, handing Blake a security badge. You are to cover the ground floor library, the main foyer, and the dining room. Do not break anything. Do not dawdle. If Mr. Romano sees you loitering, I will throw you out myself. Understood? Yes, sir, Blake muttered, already tying the white apron over her black uniform dress. The interior of the Romano house was suffocatingly grand. Hand-painted frescoes on the ceiling, floors made of imported Italian marble, and an eerie, heavy silence that felt loaded with tension. The air smelled of expensive cedar, rich coffee, and something underlying and metallic. Danger. Blake spent 3 hours meticulously dusting the mahogany shelves in the massive ground floor library. She was balancing on a step stool, wiping down a first edition set of Shakespeare, when the heavy oak doors violently swung open. Blake froze. The rule was to become invisible. She shrank back against the bookshelf, holding her breath. 2 men walked in. The air in the room instantly dropped 10 degrees. The first man was the underboss, a man Blake had heard her mother whisper about, Leo. He looked like a bull in a suit, all thick muscle and scars. But it was the second man who commanded the room, Gabriel Romano. He was breathtakingly lethal, tall, with shoulders broad enough to eclipse the morning light streaming through the massive windows. He wore a bespoke charcoal suit without a tie, the top 2 buttons of his crisp black shirt undone. His hair was dark, raked back ruthlessly, and his jaw looked like it had been carved from granite. But it was his eyes that made Blake's blood run cold. They were pitch black, devoid of warmth, analyzing the room with the precision of a predator. Costa thinks he can move product through the docks without paying the tax. Gabriel's voice was low, smooth, and dangerously calm. It wasn't a shout, but the quiet authority in it made the hairs on Blake's arms stand up. I'll send a crew tonight to burn the shipment, boss, Leo grunted. Make an example of him. No, Gabriel said, walking toward the grand desk in the center of the room. He poured a glass of amber liquid from a crystal decanter. Burning it is too loud. We take the shipment. We sell it to his rivals at half the price. Let the streets know Silas Costa is bleeding money. Humiliation is far more effective than fire, Leo. Blake, perched on her stepstool in the corner shadows, shifted her weight ever so slightly. Her shoes squeaked against the wood. The sound was microscopic, but in the echoing library, it might as well have been a gunshot. Gabriel stopped mid-pour. He didn't turn his head. He just shifted his dark eyes toward the corner of the room. Come out, Gabriel commanded. 2 words, no raised voice. But the absolute certainty of obedience in his tone made Blake's knees tremble. Slowly, she stepped off the stool, keeping her eyes glued to the expensive Persian rug. Her heart was beating so fast she felt nauseous. She stepped into the light, clutching the yellow dusting cloth to her chest like a shield. Gabriel turned fully to face her. He took a sip of his drink, his eyes raking over her cheap uniform, her sensible shoes, her pale, terrified face. Who are you? He asked. See Blake, sir. Blake Hastings. I'm filling in for my mother, Martha. She's injured. Gabriel set the glass down. The sharp clink made Blake flinch. He walked toward her, his footsteps silent on the rug. When he stopped, he was entirely too close. He towered over her, smelling of expensive bergamot and dark roasted coffee. Martha, Gabriel mused softly. The woman who cleans the East Wing. A hard worker. Never speaks out of turn. Never eavesdrops in my private library. I wasn't eavesdropping, Blake said quickly, looking up for a fraction of a second before remembering her mother's warning and snapping her eyes back to his polished shoes. I was just dusting the top shelves. I was trying to be invisible. Gabriel let out a sound that might have been a scoff. Invisible? Right. You heard my conversation with Leo. No, sir. I didn't hear a word, Blake lied, her voice shaking. I was focused on the dust. Gabriel leaned down slightly, his mouth inches from her ear. His voice was a silken threat. If a word of what you didn't hear leaves this room, Blake Hastings, you won't need to worry about your mother's injuries. You will both have much bigger problems. Do you understand me? Yes, Mr. Romano. Crystal clear. Get out. Blake didn't need to be told twice. She practically bolted for the heavy oak doors, slipping out into the hallway and leaning against the cold wall, gasping for air as if she had just escaped drowning. The tension in the Romano estate reached a boiling point by noon. Blake was in the grand foyer, applying wax to the sweeping mahogany banister of the main staircase. Suddenly, the quiet, oppressive atmosphere of the house shattered. Radios began crackling on the lapels of every security guard in sight. Men in suits began sprinting past her, their faces pale with panic. He's gone again. One guard hissed to another near the front door. Front gate camera caught him slipping out during the shift change. The boss is going to skin us alive. Seconds later, Gabriel Romano appeared at the top of the grand staircase. The cold, calculated composure he had shown in the library was gone. In its place was a terrifying, barely contained fury. "Find him," Gabriel roared, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "I don't care if you have to tear this city apart brick by brick. You do not come back without my father. Go." Blake kept her head down, rubbing the wax in tight, frantic circles. She realized then that the boss wasn't just worried about his territory or his shipments. The impenetrable Gabriel Romano had a weak spot: his father. For the next 2 hours, the house felt like a war zone. Gabriel paced the foyer, a phone glued to his ear, snapping orders in rapid-fire Italian. He looked completely unhinged, the polished exterior cracking to reveal a desperate son. Blake tried to make herself as small as possible, moving to the edges of the room to polish the baseboards. Finally, the heavy double doors of the mansion were pushed open. "Boss, we got him," Leo said, stepping into the foyer, out of breath. Found him 3 miles down the road, walking toward the highway. Behind Leo, 2 massive guards gently escorted an older man into the house. Blake looked up from her baseboards. Her rag slipped from her fingers, hitting the floor with a soft thud. It was him, the old man from the bodega, the man in the tattered tweed coat. He had been cleaned up. He was now wearing a plush cashmere sweater and tailored trousers, but it was undeniably him. The silver hair, the pale blue eyes. Vincenzo Romano, the former boss, the man she had bought a $10 bowl of minestrone soup for. Gabriel rushed forward, the anger evaporating from his face, replaced by a profound, agonizing relief. He placed his hands gently on the old man's shoulders. "Papa," Gabriel said, his voice softer than Blake could have ever imagined it being. "What are you doing? You can't leave the grounds. It's not safe." Vincenzo looked at his son, his eyes cloudy, the dementia pulling him back into the fog. "I was looking for the fountain, Gabriel. I told you. I needed to wait by the fountain. The girl said you weren't there." Gabriel frowned, exchanging a look with Leo. "What girl, Papa? You were wandering down the highway." "The girl with the umbrella. The one who bought me soup. She is an angel, Gabriel. You should meet her. She has a kind heart, not like the vultures you surround yourself with." Blake was frozen against the wall. She prayed to every deity she knew that she would sink into the floorboards. She began inching toward the hallway leading to the servants' quarters. Suddenly, Vincenzo turned his head. His eyes swept across the grand foyer, past the armed guards, past the expensive art, and landed directly on Blake trying to slip away. The fog in his eyes vanished entirely. "There," Vincenzo said, pointing a shaking, liver-spotted finger directly at her. "There she is, my angel." The entire room went dead silent. Every guard, including Leo, turned to look at the maid, pressed against the wall. Gabriel slowly turned around, his dark eyes locked onto Blake. The softness he had shown his father disappeared instantly, replaced by a sharp, lethal suspicion. He recognized her. The maid from the library, the eavesdropper. He closed the distance between them in 3 long, predatory strides, stopping just inches from her. "You," Gabriel said, his voice a low, dangerous hum. "How do you know my father?" Blake's throat was dry. She looked past Gabriel to Vincenzo, who was smiling at her warmly, and then back up to the towering, furious Mafia boss. I didn't know he was your father," Blake stammered, her voice echoing in the quiet foyer. "Don't lie to me," Gabriel snarled, his hand snapping out to grab her upper arm. His grip wasn't bruising, but it was inescapable. "My father vanishes, and suddenly, the daughter of my maid, a girl who sneaks into my private library, is the one he's talking about? Who do you work for? Did Costa send you?" "No, let me go." Blake jerked her arm, but it was useless. "I met him on Tuesday. In Brooklyn. It was raining and he was freezing outside a bodega. He said he was looking for a fountain. I just bought him a bowl of soup. That's it." Gabriel stared down at her, his jaw ticking. He was searching her face, looking for a lie, for a flicker of deception. "Gabriel, let her go." Vincenzo's voice cracked like a whip across the room. It wasn't the voice of a confused old man. It was the voice of the Don who had ruled the underworld for 30 years. Gabriel released her arm instantly, stepping back, though his eyes never left Blake's face. Vincenzo walked slowly toward Blake. He reached out and gently patted her cheek. "Blake Hastings," he said, smiling. "I still owe you for the minestrone." It was good, but not as good as Rosa's. Gabriel looked from his father to the trembling girl in the maid's uniform. His mind was racing, calculating the impossibilities. This girl, in cheap shoes, struggling to breathe under his gaze, had found his father on the streets and protected him. The dynamic in the room shifted irreversibly. Gabriel owed a blood debt to a maid. And in the world of the Romanos, a debt was a dangerous thing to hold. The silence in the grand foyer was heavy enough to crush bone. Gabriel stared at the terrified girl in the cheap black dress and white apron, his mind working with the cold, mechanical precision that had made him the most feared man on the eastern seaboard. In the world of La Cosa Nostra, coincidence was a myth. People didn't just bump into the retired Don of the Romano family on a rainy street in Brooklyn. But as Gabriel looked into Blake's wide, hazel eyes, he saw no deception, only genuine, unadulterated terror. "Leo," Gabriel said softly, breaking the tension. He didn't take his eyes off Blake. "Get my father to his suite. Have Dr. Sterling examine him." "Come on, boss," Leo murmured, gently taking Vincenzo's arm. Vincenzo allowed himself to be led away, but not before looking back at Blake. "I will see you for dinner, Angel. We will have minestrone." When the heavy oak doors of the east wing clicked shut, Gabriel stepped closer to Blake. She instinctively pressed her back flat against the wall, her knuckles white as she gripped her dusting cloth. "My office." "Now," Gabriel ordered. Blake's legs felt like lead, but she forced herself to follow the broad-shouldered mobster through a maze of corridors until they reached a room that smelled of expensive leather, Cuban cigars, and dangerous secrets. Gabriel walked behind a massive mahogany desk and gestured to a leather chair opposite him. Blake remained standing. "Sit," he commanded, his voice leaving no room for argument. Blake sat, perching on the very edge of the cushion. Gabriel didn't speak immediately. He opened a laptop on his desk, his dark eyes scanning the screen. For 3 agonizing minutes, the only sound was the rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner. "Blake Hastings," Gabriel finally said, reading from the glowing screen. The speed with which his men had pulled her life apart was terrifying. 22 years old, community college student. You're 2 semesters away from a nursing degree. You work at a diner in Bay Ridge, making minimum wage, plus tips. Your mother, Martha, owes exactly $42,680 in medical debt to Mount Sinai Hospital for a series of failed rheumatoid arthritis treatments, and she desperately needs a bi-weekly infusion of Humira that her insurance just denied. Blake's breath hitched. How? How do you have that? That's my private information. That's a HIPAA violation. Gabriel actually laughed, a dark, humorless sound that sent a shiver down her spine. "Miss Hastings, I own the shipping lanes from Queens to New Jersey, 3 city councilmen, and half the judges in the appellate court. You think a hospital firewall is going to keep me out?" He closed the laptop with a snap. He leaned forward, bracing his elbows on the desk, clasping his large hands together. The silver rings on his fingers caught the dim light. "Here is the reality of your situation," Gabriel stated, his voice devoid of emotion. "You did a kindness for my father. In my world, a debt of honor is absolute. But you are also a liability. You know his face. You know his condition. My enemies, like Silas Costa, would pay $1 million for the information that Vincenzo Romano's mind is slipping. They would use him to get to me. I won't tell anyone," Blake pleaded, her voice trembling. "I swear. I just want to do my job, collect my mother's paycheck, and go home." "Your mother is fired," Gabriel said coldly. Blake's heart plummeted into her stomach. "What? No. Please, Mr. Romano. We need that money to survive. She didn't do anything wrong. I was the one who—" "Quiet," Gabriel interrupted, raising a single finger. "Martha is fired from her position as a maid. Instead, she will receive a full pension, effective immediately, covering her previous salary, plus full premium medical insurance that covers her Humira infusions." Blake blinked, the whiplash of his words leaving her dizzy. I don't understand." "Nothing is free, Blake," Gabriel murmured, leaning back in his chair. The predatory gleam returned to his black eyes. I am paying off your mother's Mount Sinai debt today, but in exchange, you belong to me. Blake's blood ran cold. Excuse me? My father is a proud man. He refuses a traditional nurse. He throws his medication at the wall, but he remembers you. He likes you. Gabriel's gaze traced the lines of her pale face, lingering on the nervous flutter of her pulse at the base of her throat. You are a nursing student. You will drop your diner job. You will move into the west wing of this estate. You will become Vincenzo's personal caretaker, monitor his vitals, administer his medication, and keep him from wandering. You will be on call 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. I have classes, Blake stammered, trying to find a way out of the invisible cage closing around her. I have clinicals at Bellevue Hospital. I will arrange for a private car to take you to and from Bellevue. But when you are not in class, you are here. If you accept, your mother lives comfortably, gets her treatments, and your debt vanishes. Gabriel stood up, walking slowly around the desk until he was standing directly in front of her chair. If you decline, I have no reason to trust you, and a girl who knows too much about the Romano family might find her life in Brooklyn becoming very difficult. It wasn't a choice. It was an ultimatum wrapped in a velvet threat. Blake looked up at the ruthless, beautiful man towering over her. She thought of her mother's agonizing cough, the stack of overdue bills on their kitchen counter, and the empty refrigerator. Do we have a deal, Miss Hastings? Gabriel asked, extending his hand. Blake slowly stood up. Her hand shook as she placed it in his. His grip was firm, his skin warm and calloused, a sharp contrast to the ice in his veins. We have a deal, Blake whispered. Good, Gabriel said, his thumb subtly brushing against the back of her hand before he let go. Pack your bags. You start tonight. 3 weeks into her new life at the Romano estate, Blake felt like she was living in a gilded cage. Her bedroom in the West Wing was larger than her entire Brooklyn apartment. The mattress felt like a cloud, and her closet had been mysteriously stocked with expensive, understated clothing, cashmere sweaters, and tailored slacks that replaced her worn-out jeans. But the luxury was a thin veneer over a terrifying reality. Vincenzo, despite his cognitive decline, was a charming and gentle patient. He called her Angel, regaled her with lucid, sweeping tales of the old neighborhood in Little Italy, and dutifully took his pills when she crushed them into his evening tea. But it was Gabriel who kept Blake on edge. He was a ghost in his own home. He left before dawn and returned long after midnight, but Blake felt him everywhere. She felt the weight of his gaze through the security cameras. Sometimes, late at night, she would see his imposing silhouette standing in the gardens, smoking a single cigarette in the dark, the red cherry glowing like a warning beacon. The uneasy peace shattered on a humid Thursday night in late April. Blake was in the massive industrial kitchen, boiling water for chamomile tea. It was 2 a.m. The house was dead quiet, save for the hum of the sub-zero refrigerators. Suddenly, the heavy back door connecting the kitchen to the private garage burst open. Blake jumped, nearly dropping her mug. Leo stumbled into the kitchen, his face an ashen, sickly gray. But it wasn't Leo who made Blake gasp. It was the man leaning heavily against him, Gabriel. Gabriel's charcoal suit jacket was off, and his crisp white dress shirt was soaked in a spreading, horrifying crimson stain on his left side, just below the ribs. He was breathing heavily, his teeth gritted in agony. Boss, we gotta go to Mount Sinai. You're losing too much blood, Leo grunted, struggling to support Gabriel's massive frame. No hospitals, Gabriel snarled, his voice tight with pain. Costa's men hid us in the alley. If I show up at an ER with a stab wound, the police file a report. It hits the streets that I'm weak. We handle it here. I ain't a doctor, Gabe. I don't know how to sew you up, Leo yelled in a panic. Put him on the island, a voice commanded. Both men snapped their heads up. Blake was standing by the stove, her fear momentarily eclipsed by years of rigorous medical training. Adrenaline flooded her system. She wasn't looking at a Mafia boss anymore. She was looking at a hemorrhaging patient. What are you doing? Get back to your room, Gabriel gritted out, swaying on his feet. Shut up and sit him on the stainless steel prep island before he bleeds out on the marble, Blake ordered, her voice cracking like a whip. Leo didn't hesitate. He hoisted Gabriel onto the cold metal surface of the kitchen island. Gabriel groaned, his head falling back against the hanging pot rack. Blake sprinted to the estate's massive first aid station in the utility room. She had inventoried it on her second day. It was stocked better than most urgent care clinics. She grabbed trauma shears, gauze, bottles of saline, a suture kit, lidocaine, and sterile gloves, dumping everything onto the counter next to Gabriel. Leo, go stand guard outside. Don't let anyone in. If the staff sees him like this, the rumors will start, Blake said, snapping on her blue nitrile gloves. Leo looked at Gabriel, who gave a sharp, definitive nod. The underboss rushed out, locking the heavy door behind him. Blake stepped between Gabriel's legs as he sat on the edge of the island. "I have to cut the shirt," she said, her voice strictly professional. Gabriel looked down at her. His face was pale, sweat beading on his forehead, but his black eyes were intensely focused on her face. "It's a Tom Ford shirt, Angel," he murmured, a grim attempt at a joke. "Charge it to my account," Blake shot back. She slid the trauma shears beneath the bloody fabric and sliced cleanly up the side. She peeled the ruined shirt away, exposing his torso. He was carved from granite, covered in faded, violent scars that told the story of a brutal life. But Blake focused solely on the fresh, jagged puncture wound on his left oblique. It was deep, but thankfully, the blood was dark and oozing, not bright and spurting. He hadn't hit an artery. "It's a knife wound, roughly 3 inches deep. Missed the lung and the spleen by a fraction," Blake analyzed aloud, grabbing a bottle of sterile saline. "This is going to burn like hell. I need to irrigate the wound to clear out any fabric or debris." "Do it," Gabriel rasped, gripping the edges of the metal table until his knuckles popped. Blake squeezed the saline directly into the open wound. Gabriel's entire body went rigid. A low, guttural animal sound escaped his throat, but he didn't pull away. She worked fast, wiping away the blood with gauze. She loaded a syringe with lidocaine, local anesthetic. "Small pinch," she warned, injecting the numbing agent around the edges of the laceration. As she waited a minute for the lidocaine to take effect, the adrenaline began to recede, leaving an intense, suffocating awareness in its wake. She was standing intimately close to Gabriel Romano. She could feel the heat radiating off his bare skin. She could smell the metallic tang of his blood mixed with his expensive cologne. She looked up to check his face. He was staring down at her. The pain in his eyes was masked by something else, a dark, simmering intensity that made Blake's breath catch in her throat. "You didn't run," Gabriel observed quietly, his voice a low rumble in the quiet kitchen. "The door was open. I was incapacitated. You could have walked out. I made a deal," Blake said softly, dropping her eyes to her suture kit. She pulled out the curved needle and the black nylon thread. "And I'm a nurse. I don't leave people bleeding on kitchen tables." "Even monsters?" Gabriel asked, a cynical twist to his lips. Blake paused, the needle hovering over his skin. She met his pitch-black gaze. "I'm not the judge, Mr. Romano. I'm just the one holding the needle." She began to stitch. She moved with practiced precision, her hands steady, even though her heart was hammering against her ribs. Gabriel didn't flinch. He just watched her, his eyes tracking every movement of her hands, every flutter of her eyelashes. "Your hands are shaking, Blake," he murmured, lifting one large, blood-stained hand to gently wrap his fingers around her wrist. The contact sent a shockwave through her system. "I'm concentrating," she lied, her voice breathless. "Costa tried to end me tonight," Gabriel said, his thumb lightly stroking the inside of her wrist, right over her racing pulse. "If he had succeeded, my father would be defenseless. You would be free of your debt." Blake tied off the last knot and snipped the thread. She applied a sterile dressing and taped it down tightly. She stepped back, breaking his grip on her wrist, suddenly feeling desperate for air. "You're done," she said, her voice trembling slightly as she stripped off her bloody gloves. "Take 2 amoxicillin every 8 hours to prevent infection. Keep the dressing dry. And if you rip these stitches, I'm going to charge you double." Gabriel let out a soft, genuine laugh, a sound so rare and startling it made Blake freeze. He slowly slid off the metal island, wincing slightly as his feet hit the floor. He was towering over her again, his bare, heavily tattooed chest inches from her face. He reached out, his hand hovering near her cheek before he thought better of it, and let it drop. "Thank you, Blake," Gabriel said. The cold Mafia boss entirely stripped away, leaving only a man standing in the ruins of his own violent life. As he turned and walked slowly out of the kitchen, Blake leaned heavily against the counter, pressing her hand over her chest to calm her racing heart. She realized with terrifying clarity that she wasn't just trapped in Vincenzo Romano's debt anymore. She was being pulled into Gabriel's darkness, and the most dangerous part was, she wasn't sure she wanted to escape. The morning after the impromptu surgery, the Romano estate felt different. The oppressive, terrifying air that usually choked the hallways had shifted into something far more dangerous, a fragile, unspoken intimacy. Blake barely slept. When she walked into Vincenzo's suite at 7 a.m., carrying his morning regimen of blood pressure medication and a silver tray with a poached egg and toast, she was running purely on adrenaline and dark roast coffee. Vincenzo was already awake, sitting in his velvet armchair by the window, staring out at the sprawling, manicured gardens. "Good morning, Angel," Vincenzo said, his pale blue eyes clear and focused. It was one of his good days. "Good morning, Mr. Romano. How are you feeling today?" Blake asked, setting the tray down and checking his resting pulse. "Strong, steady. I feel like an old fool locked in a museum," Vincenzo grumbled, though his lips twitched with a ghost of a smile. "Gabriel smothers me. He built this fortress in Sands Point to keep the wolves out, but he forgets that I was the one who taught him how to hunt." Blake paused, her fingers lingering on his wrist. "He just wants you safe. Silas Costa is making things difficult." Vincenzo's gaze sharpened, cutting through her like a scalpel. For a terrifying second, Blake saw the ruthless Don who had controlled the 5 boroughs for decades. "Costa is a rat who got fat on the scraps I left behind in East Harlem. Gabriel is too smart to let a rat bite his ankles. Speaking of my son, I understand you have a steady hand with a needle, Blake." Blake's heart stopped. "I don't know what you mean." "My suite is directly above the kitchen," Vincenzo murmured, turning his gaze back to the gardens. "I may be losing my memory, but my hearing is still sharp. I heard the door. I heard Leo panicking. I heard you take control. You saved his life, didn't you?" "I just patched a cut," Blake deflected, her cheeks burning. "You did more than that. You saw him bleed. You saw the cracks in his armor, and you didn't run away." Vincenzo reached out and patted her hand. "Gabriel is a hard man. He had to be, to take my place. He doesn't trust anyone. But he trusted you. Do not take that lightly." Later that afternoon, the suffocating tension of the house drove Blake out into the estate's massive glass conservatory. It was a humid, sprawling greenhouse filled with exotic orchids and imported Italian lemon trees. She needed a moment to breathe, a moment away from the medical charts and the constant presence of armed guards in the hallways. She was sitting on a wrought iron bench, her eyes closed, listening to the drip of the irrigation system, when the heavy glass door clicked open. Gabriel stepped inside. He moved a little slower than usual, his posture slightly rigid to accommodate the stitches in his side, but he was dressed impeccably in a navy suit, looking every inch the untouchable kingpin. He spotted her and walked down the gravel path, the scent of his bergamot cologne mixing dangerously with the sweet smell of the orchids. "Hiding from my father, Miss Hastings?" Gabriel asked, stopping a few feet from her bench. "No, just getting some air," Blake said, standing up quickly. "How is your side?" "Sore, but I'm alive. Leo says you missed your calling as a battlefield surgeon." Gabriel's dark eyes swept over her face, lingering on the dark circles under her eyes. "You look exhausted." "I'm fine, I'm just adjusting. I had my accountant transfer the funds to Mount Sinai this morning," Gabriel stated flatly, changing the subject with whiplash speed. "Your mother's debt is cleared. The hospital administrator at New York Presbyterian confirmed her slot for the Humira infusions starting next week. Dr. Eris Thorne will be her primary rheumatologist. He's the best in the state." Blake gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. She had known he promised it, but hearing the reality of it, knowing her mother was finally safe from the crushing weight of the medical system, broke a dam inside her. Tears welled in her eyes, spilling hot and fast down her cheeks. "Thank you," she choked out, stepping forward without thinking. "Gabriel, thank you so much." Gabriel froze as she closed the distance. For a second, he looked genuinely alarmed by her tears. He tentatively raised a hand, his knuckles brushing lightly against her cheek to wipe away a tear. The contact was electric. His thumb lingered on her skin, his breathing shallow. "Don't cry, Blake," he murmured, his voice dropping to a rough, intimate timbre. "I didn't do it out of charity. You bought my life last night." "You didn't have to get her the best doctor in Manhattan," Blake whispered, looking up into his pitch-black eyes. "I protect what is mine," Gabriel said simply. The words hung in the humid air, loaded with a possessive weight that made Blake's pulse hammer. Before he could say another word, the glass house door banged open. Silas, the gaunt, severe estate manager, stood in the doorway, his eyes darting between Gabriel and Blake with deep suspicion. "Mr. Romano," Silas said, his voice tight. "We have a problem at the Red Hook docks. One of the cargo ships was intercepted by the Coast Guard. Someone tipped them off about the hidden compartments in the hull." Gabriel's hand dropped from Blake's face. The softness in his eyes vanished, instantly replaced by a glacial, murderous fury. "Prepare the SUV," Gabriel ordered, sweeping past Silas without another look. As the greenhouse doors shut, Blake was left alone in the stifling heat, a sudden, cold dread settling in her stomach. Someone inside the Romano family was a traitor, and she had a terrible feeling she knew who it was. 2 days passed. The estate was on lockdown. Security had been doubled, and the massive wrought iron gates remained firmly shut. Gabriel had practically vanished, running his war against Silas Costa from heavily fortified safe houses in the city. Blake was left alone with Vincenzo, the staff, and Silas, the estate manager. Ever since the incident in the greenhouse, Silas had been watching her. He shadowed her movements, lingering in the hallways when she brought Vincenzo his meals, and questioning the inventory of the medical supplies. He was looking for a reason to throw her out, to break the strange, protective hold Gabriel had placed over her. It was late Friday evening. Vincenzo had fallen asleep early after a grueling bout of confusion where he had paced his room for hours, calling out for his late wife, Rosa. Blake was exhausted. She went down to the main kitchen to grab a bottle of water before bed. The kitchen was empty, the staff having retired for the night. As Blake passed the open door of Silas's private ground-floor office, she heard a voice. It was low, frantic, and barely a whisper. "I told you. He's not here. Gabriel is operating out of the Astor Place penthouse," Silas was hissing into a phone. "But the old man is here. The security is tight, but they do a shift rotation at 3 a.m. at the south gate. There's a blind spot in the cameras near the oak trees." Blake stopped dead in her tracks, pressing herself flat against the cold hallway wall. Her blood turned to ice. "No, I don't want more money, Costa." "I want out," Silas pleaded, his voice cracking with fear. "Gabriel knows there's a leak. He's going to tear the organization apart until he finds it. You promised me safe passage to Montreal once you had Vincenzo." A heavy silence followed. Silas let out a ragged breath. "Fine. 3 a.m. Bring a silent crew. If the girl gets in the way, kill her. She's nothing." Blake slapped a hand over her own mouth to stifle a gasp. Silas was the rat. He was selling out Vincenzo to Silas Costa, and he had just signed her death warrant in the process. She didn't wait to hear the rest. She slipped off her shoes and ran in her stocking feet down the marble corridor, her heart threatening to beat out of her chest. She had to warn Gabriel. But she didn't have his phone number. The only person she could trust was Leo. She sprinted to the security barracks behind the main house, bursting through the door. Leo was sitting at a table, cleaning a matte black Glock, a half-eaten sandwich next to him. "Whoa, kid, what's the fire?" Leo asked, jumping up, his hand instinctively gripping the weapon. "It's Silas, the estate manager," Blake gasped, doubling over to catch her breath. "He's the leak, Leo. He's working for Costa. I just heard him on a burner phone, Costa is sending a hit squad tonight at 3 a.m. to take Vincenzo. They're coming through the south gate." Leo's face hardened into a mask of pure violence. He didn't question her. He didn't hesitate. He pulled his radio from his belt. "Lock down the south perimeter. Shoot to kill," Leo barked into the mic. He grabbed Blake by the shoulders. "You go get the boss's father. You take him down to the panic room beneath the wine cellar. You lock the biometric door from the inside, and you do not open it for anyone except me or Gabriel. You understand?" "Yes." Blake nodded frantically. "What about Gabriel? He needs to know." "I'll make the call. Go." Blake ran back to the main house. The clock in the foyer read 2:15 a.m. They had 45 minutes. She burst into Vincenzo's suite. The old man was fast asleep, his chest rising and falling rhythmically. "Mr. Romano." "Vincenzo, wake up," Blake urged, shaking his shoulder gently but firmly. He blinked awake, disoriented. "Rosa, is it time for church?" "No, Vincenzo, it's Blake. We have to go downstairs. It's not safe here. Gabriel needs us to wait in the cellar." The mention of Gabriel's name snapped a modicum of clarity into his eyes. He sat up, allowing Blake to throw a heavy wool robe over his shoulders. She practically dragged him down the grand staircase, bypassing the elevators, afraid the power might be cut. As they reached the ground floor, all the lights in the estate suddenly plunged into darkness. Blake screamed as a hand grabbed her violently by the hair, yanking her backward. "Going somewhere, little nurse?" Silas sneered, stepping out of the shadows, a suppressed pistol pressed hard against her temple. The cold steel of the gun barrel against her skin sent a shock of pure terror through Blake's system. In the dim moonlight filtering through the foyer windows, Silas looked deranged, a cornered rat willing to bite through bone to escape. "Let her go, Silas," Vincenzo commanded. The old man stood tall, leaning heavily on his wooden cane. The dementia was entirely gone. He was the Don once more, staring down a traitor in his own home. "You betray my family. You betray my son. You will not survive this night." "Shut up, old man," Silas shouted, his hand trembling so violently the gun barrel rattled against Blake's skull. "Gabriel is a mad dog. Costa is going to gut this family, and I refuse to go down with the sinking ship. Now, you're going to walk out the front door with me, Vincenzo, or I blow her brains all over this imported marble. You shoot her, and every guard in this house will descend on you before the casing hits the floor." A voice echoed from the darkness of the second-floor landing. It was Gabriel. Blake's breath hitched. She couldn't see him, but his voice was a lethal, commanding force that seemed to vibrate through the walls. "Stay back, Gabriel. I'll do it," Silas screamed, spinning Blake around to use her as a human shield, pointing the gun blindly upward into the shadows. "You called Costa an hour ago." Gabriel's voice was terrifyingly calm, moving methodically down the sweeping staircase. He stepped into a patch of moonlight. He was holding a sleek, silver handgun, his eyes fixed on Silas with the intensity of a demon claiming a soul. "But Costa isn't coming, Silas. I intercepted his crew on the Long Island Expressway 30 minutes ago. They're all dead. You're waiting for a ghost." Silas's face crumbled into absolute despair. He realized he was utterly alone, trapped in the lion's den. "Put the gun down, Silas. You let her go, and I'll make it quick," Gabriel offered, stepping off the last stair. "You pull that trigger, and I promise you, I will keep you alive for a month, begging for an end." In that split second of Silas's hesitation, Blake relied on the one thing she knew: human anatomy. With Silas distracted by Gabriel, Blake drove her elbow backward with every ounce of strength she possessed, aiming directly for his solar plexus. The blow connected perfectly. Silas gasped, his lungs suddenly paralyzed, and his grip on her loosened. Blake dropped to the floor, covering her head. 2 deafening gunshots shattered the silence. The sound was so loud in the enclosed space that Blake's ears rang violently. She squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the burning agony of a bullet, but nothing came. She smelled the sharp, acrid scent of gunpowder and the coppery tang of fresh blood. Slowly, she opened her eyes. Silas was crumpled on the floor 10 feet away, a perfectly symmetrical bullet hole directly between his eyes. The traitor was dead before he even hit the marble. Gabriel stood over the body, his gun lowered, his chest heaving. He looked past the corpse, his frantic eyes searching the floor until they locked onto Blake. He dropped his weapon. It clattered against the floorboards as he sprinted toward her, sliding to his knees and pulling her violently into his chest. "Are you hit? Blake, talk to me. Are you bleeding?" Gabriel demanded, his hands frantically roaming over her shoulders, her back, searching for blood. His voice, normally so controlled, was raw and fractured. "I'm okay. I'm okay," Blake sobbed, burying her face into his neck, clinging to the lapels of his jacket. She could feel his heart hammering against her chest like a jackhammer. The impenetrable Mafia boss was trembling. Vincenzo watched them from the shadows, a soft, knowing smile playing on his lips before he quietly turned and began walking back up the stairs, leaving his son to the woman who had just saved their family. Gabriel pulled back slightly, framing Blake's face in his large, calloused hands. His dark eyes swept over her tear-streaked face. "You could have been killed," he whispered, pressing his forehead against hers. "When Leo called and told me Silas had you cornered, I thought I was going to lose my mind. I've never been terrified in my life, Blake. Not until tonight." "He was going to take your father," Blake breathed, her hands resting on his chest, right over his heart. "I don't care about the estate. I don't care about Costa. I care about this," Gabriel said fiercely, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. "I am ending this war tonight. I'm tearing Costa out by the root. But I need you to promise me you'll stay in the safe room until I get back. Promise me." "I promise," Blake whispered. Gabriel didn't hesitate anymore. He leaned down and crushed his mouth against hers. It wasn't a gentle, romantic kiss. It was desperate, bruising, and loaded with the adrenaline of survival. It was a claim. Blake kissed him back with equal ferocity, her fingers tangling in his dark hair, entirely consumed by the dangerous, terrifying man who had just saved her life. When he finally pulled away, his eyes were burning with a dark fire. "Lock the door," he ordered softly. He stood up, grabbed his gun from the floor, and walked out into the night to burn his enemies to the ground. The fallout from the Red Hook massacre, as the tabloids would later call it, dominated the New York news cycle for weeks. The police found the bodies of Silas Costa and his top lieutenants in a burning warehouse in Brooklyn. The official report cited a gangland dispute. No arrests were made. The Romano family name was notably absent from the indictments, thanks to Gabriel's meticulous, brutal efficiency. A month had passed since the night in the foyer. The Romano estate had returned to its eerie, immaculate calm. The bloodstains had been scrubbed from the marble, the broken glass replaced. Blake was sitting on the terrace, overlooking the Long Island Sound, reading a textbook on cardiovascular pharmacology. Her life had shifted into a bizarre, surreal normalcy. Her mother was thriving, responding beautifully to the treatments at New York Presbyterian. Vincenzo's episodes of dementia had stabilized, and he spent most of his days tending to his beloved tomato plants in the garden. And Gabriel. Gabriel had changed. The icy, untouchable boss was still terrifying to the outside world, but with Blake, he was fiercely protective, stripping away his armor layer by layer. She heard the heavy tread of his footsteps on the stone terrace before she saw him. Gabriel walked out into the sunlight, dressed down in a simple black Henley and dark jeans. The bruises on his face from the final brawl with Costa had faded into pale yellow shadows. He pulled up a chair and sat across from her, crossing his arms over his broad chest. He stared at her for a long time, his expression unreadable. "I spoke with the dean of the nursing program at NYU," Gabriel said finally, his voice low. "They have an accelerated, elite program. They reviewed your transcripts from community college. They want you. Full scholarship. Housing included. You start in the fall." Blake slowly closed her textbook. She looked at him, her heart skipping a beat. You did that for me?" Gabriel reached into his pocket and pulled out a thick, sealed manila envelope. He slid it across the wrought iron table. "Your mother's medical debt is gone. Vincenzo is stable, and I have hired a team of private, discreet nurses to rotate shifts. Costa is dead. My territory is secure. Gabriel listed the facts with cold precision, though his jaw was clenched tight. Inside that envelope are the deeds to a brownstone in Park Slope for you and your mother, completely paid off, and a trust fund that will cover your living expenses for the next 10 years. You have no more obligations to this family, Blake. Your debt is paid in full. Blake stared at the envelope. It was everything she had ever dreamed of. Freedom, security, a life away from the shadows, away from the constant threat of violence. You're sending me away, Blake said, her voice barely a whisper, a sharp pain blooming in her chest. Gabriel looked away, his jaw ticking. He stared out at the gray, churning water of the Sound. I am setting you free. I am a monster, Blake. I kill people for a living. I live in a world made of blood and ashes. You are an angel who buys soup for lost old men. If you stay here, my world will eventually destroy you. Silas almost proved that. I won't let it happen. He stood up, his massive frame blocking the sun. He looked down at her, the mask of the ruthless boss firmly back in place. But his eyes, his dark, bottomless eyes, were hollow with an agonizing grief. Take the envelope, Blake. Go live a beautiful, normal life. It's what you deserve, Gabriel said, his voice cracking slightly on the last word. He turned on his heel and began walking back toward the glass doors of the mansion. Gabriel, Blake called out. He stopped, but he didn't turn around. Blake stood up. She didn't touch the envelope. She walked around the table, closing the distance between them until she was standing directly behind him. She reached out and placed her hand flat against his back, right over the spot where she had stitched him together in the kitchen. He shuddered at her touch, his shoulders dropping. When I met your father, Blake said softly, stepping around him so he was forced to look at her. He said you carried too much weight on your shoulders. He said you worried too much. I think he was right. Blake, don't, Gabriel warned, his voice tight, his eyes pleading with her to make this easy, to walk away. You don't get to decide what destroys me, Gabriel, she said fiercely, looking up into his face. You don't get to push me away because you're scared. I've seen your world. I've seen the blood. I was the one who stitched you up, remember? I didn't run then, and I'm not running now. She reached up, her hands sliding over the thick muscles of his chest, linking her fingers behind his neck. I don't want the brownstone. I don't want the normal life, Blake whispered, pulling him down toward her. I want you, monster, and all. Gabriel let out a sound that was half groan, half surrender. He wrapped his massive arms around her waist, lifting her off the ground and burying his face in the crook of her neck. He held her like a drowning man holding onto a lifeline, his absolute power entirely useless against the girl who had claimed his heart. You're crazy, Gabriel murmured against her skin, a fierce, protective smile finally breaking through his dark facade. You are completely out of your mind. Maybe, Blake smiled, resting her forehead against his. But I hear crazy runs in the Romano family. The streets of Brooklyn will always teach you the hardest lessons, but the most important one is that destiny rarely knocks on the front door. It usually waits for you shivering in the rain. Blake Hastings traded a $10 bill and a bowl of minestrone for a collision course with the underworld, but in doing so, she found the one thing she never expected, a family fiercely devoted to protecting their own. Gabriel Romano ruled an empire built on fear and violence, but the ultimate surrender wasn't to a rival syndicate, it was to the quiet, unshakable strength of the woman who saw the man beneath the monster. They built a life on the razor's edge, a beautiful, dangerous sanctuary where the Mafia king finally found his peace, anchored by the nurse who healed his wounds and the father who, in his darkest fog, had brought them together.